as Preston has introduced us, he said that this is the end of stable globalization. We can see that there have been several changes in the sector, whereby when we start from COVID coming to the war, the US-Iran war, we can see that the supply chain is not yet stable, and this is what we need to embrace for and prepare ourselves for. So in terms of what I'll cover in this discussion, I'll be looking at the US-China tensions, the regionalization and friendshoring, the Red Sea and global discussions, strategic decoupling, and what is our role since we're in Africa, what is our role as Africans and in the continent in terms of the strategic shift in supply chain. So when we look at the US-China tension war and what has been happening, we know the trade war escalation has gone so high, with the US increasing tariffs, China also increasing tariffs, and most of supply chain teams and leaders were looking at China as the main source of their production aspects, and also as main source of their goods and also parts and everything. But from the export and tariffs control, technology bans, it's actually fragmenting the global electronics and semiconductors of supply chain. So what do we need to do as supply chain specialists in terms of that? We need to look at what are these tariffs making the cause in terms of our cost of goods, our total cost of ownership of equipment, machinery, and also the services that we're providing. Then I'll look at also technology decoupling, whereby there's been restriction on chips, AI hardware, and also 5G infrastructure, forcing us to have dual supply chain infrastructure. What does this mean for our engagements? What does it mean for our operations? How do we need to place ourselves in order to avoid this? And also in terms of the sanctions and controls, there is an entity list and control limiting cross-border supplier partnership. Also, as we look in Africa, we have trade barriers, like we have economic barriers, we have trading blocks. Why can't we look at Africa and see how can we work this together? And most of these tensions, they've also led to supply chain implications where companies operating with China plus one or China N strategies are looking at diversifying to other markets that are near China or can give almost same possible costs in terms of the low production cost, and also the flexibility in terms of their supply chain. But this, us relying on US and also China, it has brought a procurement risk whereby we have a lot of single source dependency in critical components in terms of what we require for them. And I remember during COVID, we were not able to get some aspects, some parts, because I was working in a manufacturing firm then, and our main source of spare parts was in China. So it really pushed us to think outside the box. So the procurement risk of just looking at one specific market is the single source dependency. So as supply chain leaders, response, we need to map and look at our supplier exposure and also model what tariff cost scenario will be. Do we need to build a dual qualified supplier list, both locally, internationally, and if it's local, internationally, who are the other players in that system that can support us in that? So this is how now we look at how do we regionalize and how do we do friendshoring. So the new geography of global supply chain is rerouting supply chains through countries that share similar political values and security alignments, which is a shift from efficiency first to resilience first sourcing. Most of us, and I know I can say like 80% of supply chain practitioners, one of our greatest KPIs is savings. So we're always looking at efficiency. When will this good come? The fastest, the lowest cost, and the shortest route possible. So in terms of that, the global supply chain is now shifting from efficiency to resilience first. In that, should there be any shocks, any risks, anything that is coming up in the supply chains, you are able to, as in, you still get your goods at the time that you required, even if it's going to take at a longer time. Then looking at what we need to process. So like we look at nearshoring, the Americas, areas like, instead of relying on US, we can look at Mexico, and we can also drive down into North America, manufacturing renaissance, automotive, electronics, and pharma, looking at different markets in Americas, which can give us that. In terms of us looking at Europe, how do we look at the EU strategy autonomy? We look at critical raw materials diversification away from Russia and China, and looking at how can we take advantage of the EU strategy autonomy in terms of energy security, reshaping the industrial location decisions, now moving away from Russia, the main guys, Russia and China, and looking at other options. Also, we can look at the Indo-Pacific pivot, whereby Asia is looking at rebalancing, and we are looking at leaders who are coming up like Vietnam, India, and Indonesia, emerging as new hubs whereby you can get quite cost-effective, faster, and even maybe better quality than China in terms of that. So we need to look at the frameworks that will shape trading rules across 14 economies, and that will be positive to us in Africa. And closer to the time that we're discussing, we've seen the Red Sea and the global disruptions. We've seen the attacks, the missiles and drone attacks in 2023 to 2024 on commercial vessels, whereby it forced people to change the rerouting of their cargo, of their ships, in terms of the route that they had actually seen before, but now, since of these attacks, they needed to change it. We had the Panama Canal water crisis, where historic drought reduced the canal capacity by 30 to 40%, making us having backlogs, affecting agricultural exports and also shipments and manufactured goods. So when we look at this global disruptions, as supply chain leaders, what is our action? We need to look at dual routing strategies. And as I've said in my previous slide, we need to look at more resilient supply chains rather than looking at efficient supply chains. So in terms of that, how do we now look? We have to decouple. We have to strategically decouple from efficiency first to resilience first. So you'll go with the resilience first, then you come to the efficiency. Because as supply chain professionals, we also need to have that efficiency. So the various dimensions that I'll look at here will be the core driver, the supplier strategy, inventory philosophy, technology, the geopolitical filter, and also lead times. So in terms of, rather than looking at cost efficiency and the savings that we usually look at, we need to look at resilience and security. How, when you go to this market, how are our products, what we are sourcing, resilient, and how secure are we that we'll get these goods at the required times? Because for those of us who work in manufacturing setup, you know that a minute lost in the factory is profits actually lost. So we also need to look at how we're securing the company in terms of ensuring that we continue production, we don't go into losses. Then in terms of supplier strategy, rather than looking at a single source, which is the global lowest cost, and in this particular case, I'd be looking at China, we need to have multiple sources that are well geopolitically vetted. In that, they are, as we engage them, we will not be found in a status that we cannot get specific items from these people due maybe to their political standing, or maybe the wars they have maybe with other countries. Then when we look at inventory, rather than having just in time, we'll need to have just in case and strategic reserves. We need to put our goods in the Kaldrick matrix and look at what are these bottleneck items, what are these strategic items, so that we ensure we have we have right inventory in terms of our production and also in terms of our processes. Then in terms of technology, we've been having many shared platforms, open standards whereby everyone is able to share. I think this is one thing that technology has made for us to be able to access markets and all that. But in terms of the cyber security that is happening, the zero trust in terms of procurement teams. I can give examples in terms of where there's collaboration and where we lack collaboration. You'll find in some industries that there's such collaboration in the various companies that are working there for them to get the best value for money in terms of bulk purchasing or group purchasing. But in some areas, they're not there. So how can technology help us ensure we have trust in our procurement teams and also share? So in terms of geopolitical filter, we need to have an all early state alignment required, whereby we have the governments working together. We have us trusting each other. We break down the barriers in the continent so that we are able to trade easily and trade freely between countries and also between other people. So in terms of lead time, we need to, especially now when we look at the current war that is going on, most of us did not have buffer stocks for things, and maybe it caught us off guard. So what we need to do is to have very good forecasting so that we get buffer time built in for disruption tolerance so that our processes are not affected by these disruptions. So what is Africa's strategic role in this? We have Africa is the fastest growing continent and the fastest growing consumer market, whereby we have 60% of the global arable land reserves on this continent, and we are so rich in terms of minerals. When you look at countries like Congo, when you look at areas where we are able to get good minerals, but we are actually not using that as a strength. So I think we need to look at the critical mineral powerhouse and maybe even start a shipping company in Africa. We need to have continental free trade whereby we break the barriers, the ones in West Africa, the ones in East Africa, so that we just have one common Africa free trade area. Then manufacturing destination in East Africa, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Kenya. We have very, very good capacity in terms of having manufacturing industries. Why are we going out of Africa to do the manufacturing? So we need to really look, how can we do manufacturing in Africa? Because it can be a one-stop shop and it will actually give us the resilience and also the effectiveness in terms of cost. Then digital and logistics leap, we need to look at the African ports that are inland to the African countries, and we can see like the port of Lamu was quite overstretched during the war period. And we need to look at how can we do it more efficiently. Are the timelines in the port actually working for us or against us? We need to do multiple customs laws that will ensure that the turnaround time, by the time a ship comes, it docks and it's offloaded, that the time is pretty small. So as supply chain leaders, something that just a snip of it, what we need to do, we need to map our geopolitical exposure. We need to rebuild our strategic buffers. We need to diversify and have friendly show supply chains. We need to stress test our logistics. We also need to invest in real-time visibility and also engage Africans' opportunity. This is food for thought, and it will actually be extended further and discussed further by our next presenter, Maryanne, who will talk about more on that as leaders, what we need to do. So the key question I'll leave you with is, what kind of global supply chain environment are we entering? Currently, we are entering one that is defined by permanent volatility, geopolitical fragmentation, and the strategic imperative to choose resilience over pure efficiency. So that is food for thought. Let's think what will be good for Africa. What can we do for Africa so that we can create these powerful resilience supply chains? Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Margaret. for helping us to understand the broader global shift shaping supply chains today. I think the next critical question becomes, how should leaders and organizations respond strategically? And you have unpacked the introduction of it. And in other words, in a world characterized by volatility and uncertainty, traditional supply chain models are being challenged. And it then requires us, as organizations, we are now being forced to rethink resilience, to rethink agility, to rethink sourcing models and digital transformation, as well as AI integration, which then encompass the execution decision-making structures become vital and critical for supply chain leaders. You will see that leadership today is no longer just about efficiency, but it's about adaptability, foresight, and strategic resilience. I think to guide us through this important discussion, I would then want to welcome Maryanne Karanja, who is going to take us in the next presentation to delve deeper and see some of the views that will be coming in terms of how unpacking the full topic. So about Maryanne, I've known Maryanne through the SIPs. She's FSIPs, and she's one of Kenyan supply chain strategists or transformational leaders and advisors with over 20 years of experience across Africa. Her work spans procurement and supply chain strategy, governance, supply development, inclusive procurement, as well as operational transformation. She brings practical African market perspective on how organizations can respond to volatility, strengthen resilience, and make better strategic decisions in uncertain environments. Her current interests include the impact of geopolitical shifts, sanctions, regulatory change, and trade disruption on sourcing models, supply ecosystems, as well as business continuity. Maryanne has also played an active role in professional standards and supply chain leadership through services with Kenya Institute of Supply Management, KISM. Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Maryanne this afternoon. Maryanne, over to you. You can take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Preston. Please confirm you can hear me and you can see the presentation.
Yes, sure. We can see it.
Okay, wonderful. Good afternoon, esteemed colleagues from wherever you're joining. And also just taking on from the wonderful presentation from Margaret, I think the question this afternoon is, once we've understood that we're dealing in a state of perma crisis of flux, which is what I like to discuss. And I'd say, so how do we respond? How do we respond to this situation? And I think the answer is in some of the issues that have already been raised by the previous presenter, is that we're talking about resilience economics. It's understanding what risks that are worth paying for, what risks then should be mitigated and how to mitigate those risks. And what operating model should you adjust to in order to be able to react quickly? Let me say, to react, to adjust, and then to move forwards very quickly. It's also about building your portfolio of options. And this calls for us to understand the alternatives before the disruption arrives. And then asking ourselves, how do we harness technology that is existing? How do we harness the data and the insights that we have within our ecosystems and use the governance that we have to act faster? And as we progress these discussions, I'll ask everyone here to just reflect on the implications of the Strait of Hormuz. And it's because from wherever you serve, transportation sector affects all of us in terms of movement of goods and services and people. And therefore, the cost of fuel affects all of us in whichever way. So just think about that as we're talking about how we build resilience and how you would walk this journey as a leader in whichever sphere you serve. So why is this important for us? It's because, as has been stated, there's no normal. There's no normal. Actually, we should be asking normal. Normal is that the world is very dynamic, very volatile. And a lot of our leaders, and 74% even sitting in this room, would say that resilience is a strategic driver. And therefore, it becomes an imperative, especially for those. The second big piece is if you look at the spend in technology, and especially in agentic AI, if you've been following that development, then you'll see there's a lot of expenditure going into agentic AI. And therefore, we should be able to build visibility, to use the data to connect better and faster with our suppliers, but also with our customers. So there are issues, there are concerns, but there are also opportunities that are arising within the operating environment. The operating environment has also rewired. There are sanctions, there are energy shocks, and then there are very many variables that we need to deal with. And leadership agility for us then means that we need to be ahead of a curve. I know it sounds very cliche when we say it, that we need to be ahead of a curve. But oftentimes, especially if you now look at the fuel crisis, we are all reacting to fuel crisis. I mean, if you're in Kenya, you would know that we've just exited some strike, the Matatu strike, which is a public transportation strike on Monday and Tuesday, which is to protest a 25% increase in the cost of diesel. But many of us who are even in cement manufacturing have not considered that. Those of us who are dependent on electricity, if you're in Kenya, then there is a fuel factor as part of your electricity pricing tariff, which is massive, and it is set to also increase. So we are all affected. And the question is, how do we anticipate? Should we have anticipated last year or in January that this would have hit us and where it would have hit us? Because if we had anticipated where the hit would come and what the cost implication would have been, then we would have started reconfiguring and rewiring our sourcing options. Yeah. And then also shaping the conversations within the organization to make sure we rebalance maybe where the money is being spent. If you are pushing for doing more solar in your organization, then you'd say we need more capex, than had initially been anticipated because there's this hit that is coming. So it's to ask ourselves, so how do we move from being reactive and then to institutionalize anticipation and reconfiguration of our operations as a normal thing? And because you've said resilience is not a nice to have, it is our ability to make choices under pressure, then this will be deliberately designed around the few places where disruption would hurt the enterprise the most. And because we've also said we need to understand the risks, then if we've understood the risks, then we need to segment them by criticality and especially focus on the ones that are strategic or where there is a bottleneck. We also need to identify the options, and I know Margaret spoke to those, and then say, stop spreading thin volume, the volume so thin that suppliers cannot perform. But ask yourself, if you're diversifying, have you considered the end-to-end framework rather than just looking at the supplier themselves? So you're designing in a modular fashion, and you're also making sure that as you do that, you're using a lot of data to keep informing decisions going forward, because you're not the only one in the organization, especially if you're in supply chain, who's taking decisions. If you want to track routes, inventory, lead times, regulatory exposure, fuel price exposure, AI shocks or issues, then that risk picture needs to be presented and discussed in a very dynamic fashion to the board level. So our reflection here is to ask then, are you able to explain which risks, and especially if you have adopted an enterprise risk management approach, which risks you will accept, which ones you must hedge, and which ones you absolutely cannot tolerate because they could collapse your organization? And therefore, what should you be doing? One of the frameworks I've found very beneficial to use, and you can borrow this, feel free to borrow it, is to say, you need to consider where the strategic impact would be, which is on one of the axes, and then the geopolitical or the supply exposure. And the main focus is the one where there's been a highlight, where you need to redesign very urgently. I think I was reflecting on the cement manufacturers in Kenya. And I said, because the cost of fuel is such a high portion of the cost for them, many of them had started the journey towards solarizing. Now, if I was serving in one of those institutions, then now would be a good time to say, can we just go 100% solar if we haven't? Yeah, because otherwise our cement will be unaffordable. And yet, if you look at the economy, affordable country. So just look at this framework and say, where there is low strategic criticality and there's low geopolitical exposure, you have very many options within your country, within the neighboring countries, then you need to maintain a discipline. You monitor, you standardize controls, yeah, and make sure that there is continuity of supply. So having reflected on that, my question is, what is a space for technology in all of this? And I know we started by saying that there is a lot of expenditure in agentic AI. And I know many of us in this room are using AI. So one of the things I did was also to just try and see where are businesses using AI. If you check where DHL is on DHL 360, which is one of their visibility tools, that they use extensively, they layered AI on the tool. I think just before we got into COVID, I think 2019 or 2020, they already layered AI and they used it extensively to help them manage, mitigate some risks, which I think arose from Hurricane Katrina, etc., to just determine where goods should be moved to. Should they stop the movement on the road and bring goods back to the warehouse because the roads are impassable? Procter & Gamble have also used that. Walmart has also used it. And many of us, let me say in Africa, are already using AI to do certain things. Maybe we're using it for chat boxes, but ask yourself where you can use it. But even as you do that, then the one thing that everybody calls out is that for you to get to decision intelligence, you must make sure your master data is right. So this is a slide where you can consider where technology can be adopted. I'd like to call out and say that it is not a must at this stage. It is not something that should stop you from progressing your journey towards building resilience. So with that understanding, then I'll also say, so what's the governance rhythm? How are we currently structured to respond within our organizations? And I would offer that we normally have the supply chain function. So we have discussions which happen within the category of supplier teams, and therefore you can understand what is coming your way. There could be a war room or a supply risk room where you map all these risks or there is a dashboard, or you're using ResiLink as a technology tool to be able to have that visibility. Then there is EXCO, the decisions that go to your executive committee, and the decisions that must go to the board level. So the questions you must ask very frequently is, what has changed in your external risk map? Which critical suppliers or route or input is now exposed? What decision thresholds have been triggered? And do this sit within supply chain? Are these things that need to be escalated to EXCO or to the board? What is the cost implication? And what is super urgent that we cannot wait for the quarterly board meeting, but it needs to be notified immediately? And some of the things we must therefore be discussing at CEO and board level are around, and especially now, the risk appetite. Which disruptions can be tolerated? Which ones threaten the enterprise existence? And therefore, if you have done that, then you'll say, by the time I'm going to the CEO, I also need to have built options. I also need to understand where the value of continuity exceeds the cost of redundancy. So it makes no sense. Yeah. And therefore, I'll be making a recommendation. How do we strengthen our compliance muscle? How do we do better things that we currently do, like supplier due diligence? How do we empower cross-functional decision making? I know many of us have the delegation of authority or an approval hierarchy within organizations. Perhaps now it's time for us to say some decisions need to just be made at supply chain level. Some will be made at a smaller departmental committee level. Others, then the really big decisions then will go to the CEO and EXCO. So look at it that way. And then investing in digital foundations and building the supplier ecosystem. So why we are saying this is leadership starts with us in supply chain. we are taking these conversations all the way to the board and what exactly it is that we are presenting to the board. So I'll close by saying that the winning supply chain is the one with the best options when the world changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maryanne. I think you have highlighted critical issues that will maybe at the end of the session will then look at critical questions that are coming. Colleagues, welcome. For those who have just joined us, please feel free to, if you have any questions, please type your questions in the chat box. At the end of all the 4 presentations, we'll be able to address your questions. Once again, very good afternoon. Good morning to those who are connecting from the Northern America. Prof. Marcus, good morning to you. Good afternoon to those connecting in Africa, and good evening to our colleagues connecting from Asia. Welcome, and thank you very much for connecting. I think we have heard from the previous presentation that while strategy is critical, execution ultimately determines success. I think we have seen that the successful success of the supply chain will depend on the options. So across the globe, you see that organizations are grappling with customs complexity, freight volatility, border delays, regulatory uncertainty, and logistics disruption. And you see that for Africa specifically, the implementation of the AFCFTA presents tremendous potential, but operational realities remain significant. So you see that the ability to navigate trade compliances and logistics efficiency may then become one of the greatest competitive differentiators for organizations and countries alike. So to help us explore these operational realities, especially when it comes to trade, customs, and logistics in disrupted world, I would like to invite Ingrid du Buisson to present along the lines. In terms of Ingrid, Ingrid is a Chief Executive Officer at the Institute of Customs and Freight Forwarding, ICFF. Before this appointment, Ingrid was the Director of Learning and Development at DHL Express in South Africa for 4 years, as well as serving the Institute of Customs and Freight Forwarding as the President and Chairperson of the board since 2021. Ingrid commenced her career in skills development and training in 1995 with the Maritime Industry Training Board. She holds various qualifications in the field of learning and development, as well as business and project management, respectively. She obtained a Master's of Science degree in Management of Technology and Innovation, and had been appointed previously by the Accountant General, which is the National Treasury of South Africa, as the Deputy Chairperson, Professionalization for the Supply Chain Management Council. Ingrid also previously held the portfolio as Executive Officer, Forwarding and Clearing within the Transport Education Training Authority for 21 years. Over her career span, Ingrid had collaborated with both industry and public sector in developing learnership and occupational qualification in the field of international trade and logistics, as well as supply chain management. Ingrid also facilitated the development of occupational qualification in supply chain management in partnership with the QCTO and various supply chain constituents, and has developed in collaboration with industry a career framework for supply chain management in international logistics to professionalize the industry. Ingrid's passion continues to ensure that employees across the industry are well developed and capacitated, and endeavors to continue doing so for industry through her stewardship of the ICFF. She recently embarked on a PhD journey towards developing a conceptual framework for customs professionalization focusing on a South African perspective. So, ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Ingrid to present on geopolitics and strategic shift, what they mean for supply chain leaders. Ingrid, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Preston. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a cool, cloudy day here in Johannesburg in South Africa. So for the rest of you in Northern Hemisphere, it's probably warmer up there. Ladies and gents, my presentation is focused on the logistics perspective of international supply chain management. And as our previous two speakers have mentioned, quite a lot of issues around the leadership capabilities in supply chain management, what we should be looking out for, being more proactive instead of reactive, as we have seen in the past couple of years. And I don't think it's just the African continent. I think it's worldwide and globally. We have had some serious challenges along our supply chains. And again, from a logistics perspective, you can imagine the geopolitical shifts have wreaked havoc as far as especially sea freight is concerned, as well as air freight, having to change routes, having to change all sorts of strategies as far as the supply chain strategies and implementation is concerned. So essentially, again, it is, the focus from a logistics perspective, the US-China rivalry, Russia-Ukraine. I think the one that has impacted everybody the most on the African continent is the current Middle East conflict, and US and the Venezuelan-Cuba rivalry at the moment, et cetera, so I won't delve too much into that. The global trade disruptions that we see from a logistics perspective that are reshaping Africa's supply chains is forcing us as supply chain leaders to focus on resilience. How resilient are we in terms of our supply chain strategies? One very important aspect, especially for us as the African continent, is the regional integration in terms of strategies, especially for our importers and exporters, those that have got massive cross-border transits into Africa. And then for us as well as the Institute, one of the major focuses is the backbone of any supply chain globally, and that is professionalized human capital. Our people that facilitate international trade, that facilitate all these strategies within the supply chains and the value chains that we operate in, are the backbone of everything that we do. And last but not least, certainly I think in Africa, post-COVID, is the exposure of Africa's logistics vulnerabilities and the impact thereof in terms of our international supply chains, whether it's national, local, intra-Africa, or global. Logistics, the vulnerabilities that have been exposed have been phenomenal. So from an Institute of Customs and Freight Forwarding perspective, and as the only South African recognized professional body in the logistics ambit, as well as supply chain management by the South African Qualifications Authority, we have taken it upon ourselves to ensure that we build the proper capacity in terms of human capital across the logistics value chain that impacts every supply chain. And I think one of the biggest risks that any supply chain faces is that of regulatory compliance. And we have certainly witnessed that from a South African perspective in terms of customs procedures into the SADC region as well, and working with the South African Revenue Services, especially the customs side and the customs regulators, is that we've recognized that we need to build more capacity in terms of customs compliance, especially as far as the implementation of WCO, SAFE framework, customs licensing, AEO accreditation, all of those compliance regulatory requirements in any supply chain. Capacity needs to be built in those areas, because ultimately our main focus is to make every supply chain more effective, more efficient, and especially in terms of cost efficiencies, that the end user, our customers out there, are not the ones carrying the cost of insufficiencies and ineffectiveness. And that ladies and gents, is the focus from our perspective in the logistics industry to make it more effective and build capacity. Right, I think pretty much what has been mentioned previously by some of our previous presenters is what do we see from a logistics perspective as the strategic shifts for Africa, and the regionalization of the Africa free trade agreement is driving intra-Africa trade. We need to be more focused on that. Technology adoption, ladies and gents, blockchain, artificial intelligence, digital customs clearances, and a lot of the larger multinational logistics companies, such as your DHLs, your DSVs, they have got AI integrated systems in place already. But our focus mustn't just be on our large multinationals. It needs to be on the medium and smaller businesses within the African continent in terms of building their capacity, not only to be able to digitalize and adopt all the technology, but also having the human capital capacity to analyze data, to interpret data, and to convert it into processes and inform strategies. And therein lies a fundamental problem and a challenge that we are facing in the SADC region. Also, and lastly but not least, is the resilience focus, more diversified sourcing, local manufacturing, and ultimately risk management, more risk management averse. Briefly, the challenges that we are facing also from a logistics perspective as supply chain leaders is diversifying trade routes. The geopolitical rivalry has forced a lot of the logistics role players to look at alternatives away from the Middle East. And as you know, a lot of the sea freight is now being diverted past the Cape of Good Hope, which is a longer route and a more expensive route, but also the only route. And when you diversify your trade routes, you need to make sure that your human capital in the supply chain, as far as compliance, regulatory compliance, are trained and up to date in terms of what are the requirements, because that in itself has got a massive impact on the supply chain if our people do not understand the impact of diversification of trade routes. The other ultimate gap is infrastructure, higher costs, and from a human resources perspective, it's more driving efficiencies. Now, essentially, the regulatory fragmentation at the moment is looking at the inconsistent customs and the regulatory environment, country to country, continent to continent. And one of the driving mandates that we have as the Institute for Customs is that we are currently developing a national framework for customs professionalization that we have been mandated to take out into the SADC region in terms of our trading partners, so that we can build capacity and strengthen the customs regulatory environment across the SADC region. And that in itself will create more effective and efficient trade into Africa and globally. So as I said at the start of my presentation, this has got a very much a logistics focused flavor to it, because this is logistics drives any economy in any country. Fuel goes up, your food prices go up, your entire supply chain is impacted, etc., etc. And then, of course, again, the digital transformation and upskilling the workforce, and especially here in South Africa, the whole issue around digitization, artificial intelligence, blockchain is a factor that a lot of our employees in the sector are grappling with. And we are putting programs in place together with higher education institutions to cover that gap and to build that capacity. Right. So for us, from a logistics perspective, our focus is not only on infrastructure in terms of our country's rail sector and in terms of the ports, but more also onto the human capital aspect of it. So what we've done is we have built continuous professional development programs and specific career pathways, because we are at the moment advocating supply chain management, freight forwarding, customs compliance, and logistics as a career of choice, because we've got a massive talent pipeline. that we are busy developing, and we need to ensure that they are properly capacitated and curricula are up to date. What does it mean to be professionally designated as a certified supply chain practitioner in South Africa? It provides credibility. It means that you are compliance aligned. It means that you are governed by a code of ethics and a code of conduct. And that is where the leadership in supply chain management, we're advancing ethics and continuous professional development, because that is the cornerstone of any supply chain and any industry. And what does that mean? And what is its impact for Africa's supply chains, ladies and gents? It builds credibility in global trade. For our logistics companies, we have got certified freight forwarding practitioners, certified customs experts. We have got certified supply chain practitioners, and we are the only institute in Southern Africa that are recognized for professional designation in terms of building credibility, strengthening compliance, and it also enhances resilience against any geopolitical shocks, because our supply chains are being managed by qualified, certified individuals, not just in supply chain management, but in customs. And the South African Revenue Services is bringing in the criteria shortly that any individual that operates in the regulatory environment needs to be professionally designated and certified. Sorry, we've got some youngsters that are interested in supply chain. Welcome on board. Ladies and gents, at the end of the day, the impact on South Africa's, on not just South Africa's supply chains, but Africa's supply chains, is that it positions us as Africa as a logistics hub under the AfCFTA. And for us, that is critical, especially with the competition that is currently happening globally. You guys all know the shifts in international trade routes. There's a lot of opportunity here for Africa. And I think one of our strengths is for us to be managing supply chains along the international trade intra-Africa. And that's where our focus is at the moment, is building competency, capabilities on the African continent. Right, the action points for leaders in supply chain, ladies and gents, is investing in professional development of the human capital along the supply chain. And the message that we have given a lot of the executives across the supply chain ambit here in South Africa is that professional development and human capital development needs a seat around the boardroom table. Learning and development is no longer a choice. It is a have to. It is a critical imperative that needs to be present at every board discussion. Is your supply chain is only as strong as the human capability that is working across it. Okay, so we have created an entire professional ecosystem for supply chain management here in South Africa. Yes, there are a lot of American associations, European associations that profess to be professionals and set the professional standards for supply chain management, but they don't speak to the needs of the African continent. And everything that we have built here in South Africa speaks to the African continent and the way that we think and the way that we do things here on the African continent and its environment. And of course, by doing that, it's ensuring the alignment of human capital with international best practice. It leverages on regional resilience. It also integrates risk management, data analytics, and AI into supply chain strategies. And that is so important. We need to build in that capability. AI is here to stay. It's not going to go anywhere. And we need to understand that we need to leverage on it and integrate it into everything we do within the supply chain and the different elements across the supply chain. All right, so one of our strategic imperatives here locally in South Africa and into the SADC region is empowering logistics. And by empowering logistics, we are focusing on digital transformation in terms of how does it impact on our operations? And the critical question here is, are we ready? Sustainability, incorporating green logistics into the development of all our programs and our qualifications here in South Africa. Sustainability should be a golden thread throughout the entire supply chain and every value chain as far as international trade facilitation is concerned. Skills development, I've spoken about that already in terms of building proficiency, developing capacity, and which also requires innovative solutions with maximum impact. We cannot be developing human capital as we used to in the past. We need high impact delivery systems, high impact programs that are going to zone in on the capabilities of individuals within our supply chains. And then obviously, ladies and gents, it's about preparing the next generation of leaders. Leaders in supply chain management play an extremely strategic role, but are they ready? Do they have sufficient management leadership components, competencies that are integral to their function across supply chains globally? And we have continuous professional development programs that develop from junior manager to middle manager to senior manager right to executives. We as executives, we believe that we know it all, but we don't. And there is nothing wrong with us continuously developing ourselves as leaders, especially in supply chain management, to be able to be resilient. We require our staff to be resilient, our teams to be resilient, but are we as supply chain leaders, are we resilient, and do we have it what it takes to make those strategic decisions with the disruptions that we are currently facing? Right, so just briefly to share with everybody, it's the industry professional ecosystem that we have designed here in South Africa, which all encompasses both customs and regulatory compliance, freight forwarding and supply chain management. And this is the logistics ecosystem in supply chain management. And I'm quite happy to share that it is available on our website. I won't delve too much into that, but all of our systems, especially in our smart programs, do incorporate artificial intelligence, data analytics as a key critical fundamental component of developing our leaders in terms of technology, innovation, people and systems. Right, professional designations. We recently launched our professional designations. So here in South Africa and into Africa, we have availability of professional designations as supply chain junior practitioners, senior practitioners, supply chain management practitioners, and supply chain expert practitioners, specifically along planning, warehousing, and logistics. We have various qualifications and the experiences that are required in order to attain those professional designations. And we do recognize prior experience as well. We have got the proficiency platforms and frameworks for supply chain management, which are recognized by the South African Qualifications Authority. So they are certified, and our individuals that sit the evaluation assessment programs with us will then be professionally designated. Once an individual is designated with a particular title, then the industry and the economy know that, let's say, from Marcus, you are a competent, registered, certified supply chain expert practitioner, and the industry recognizes this because all of this has been designed according to industry best practice, which encompasses international best practice as well. Right, so essentially, ladies and gents, from a logistics perspective, I leave you with this closing thought. Professionalized human capital is Africa's strongest defense against geopolitical uncertainty and its greatest asset for supply chain leadership. I will leave you with that. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, guys.
Wow, thank you very much, Ingrid, for such a quite full, a thoughtful and insightful presentation. You know, as we look towards the future, I think one important question that remains to us as professionals is that, do we have the talent and leadership capability required for this new era. You know, the future of supply chain leadership will require competencies far beyond just the traditional procurement and logistics skill. You see that tomorrow's leaders will need strategic thinking, digital fluency, geopolitical awareness, sustainability, understanding, risk management capability, and adaptive leadership skills. You know, this raises even important questions around curriculum designs. The curriculums that we are going through, are they still relevant, or something needs to be revamped and needs to be redone? Thanks a lot for even showing the qualification framework that you also highlighted, and I hope and believe that you guys will continue to revamp this curriculum so that it remains relevant to the current needs of the professional. The issues to do with workforce readiness, industry, academia, collaboration, I think these are the critical issues that we need to ensure that we try to enforce as we go forward in terms of building the skill set that industry wants, rather than for universities or professional bodies just to produce qualified people, but without relevance when it comes to the industry themselves. I think there's also the aspect of leadership development across Africa. I think this is an area where the Institute of Supply Chain Research comes in, where we are trying to see that can there be leadership development across Africa to help people grow, to help professionals grow as they, to becoming relevant in various ways of operation. So, ladies and gentlemen, to help us even reflect on the future of supply chain capability development, it is my pleasure that I want to welcome our last speaker, Dr. Ogochukwu Ugboma. She will talk about these issues, and will also need to learn and take notes from a presentation. So Dr. Ogochukwu Ugboma is an associate professor and dean of the School of Transport and Logistics, Lagos State University in Nigeria. She is a distinguished academic, industry expert, thought leader in transport, logistics, and supply chain. She serves as the global vice chairperson for North and West Africa at Women in Logistics and Transport, WILAT, where she drives regional capacity development, mentorship, professional advancement initiatives. As a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, SILT, and the African Center for Research, African Center for Supply Chain, she actively mentors emerging scholars and practitioners, shaping the next generation of African transport leaders. She is committed to advancing knowledge through research, mentorship, and policy advocacy. Her work bridges theory, practice, integrating logistics performance, transport, and equity, sustainable supply chain, and skill development across Africa. Actively engaged in professional networks, she continues to contribute to conferences, scholarly publications, policy dialogues, and cross-sector collaboration. Through teaching, research, consultancy, and advocacy, she advanced the logistics and transport system as strategic enablers of sustainable economic growth, gender inclusion, and resilient supply chains. So, ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Dr. Ogochukwu Ugboma for her presentation. Over to you, Doc.
Hello, Preston. Good afternoon, everyone. Please, can you confirm if you're hearing me, Preston, and seeing my slide? Am I audible enough?
Yes, you are very audible, Doc. You can proceed.
Oh, great, because I'm struggling with my bandwidth here. I would have put my camera on so that at least the viewers will put a face to the voice. But I think at the end of the presentation, we may have to do that. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, everyone on this platform today, all our distinguished colleagues, our industry leaders. I believe some of my fellow academics are here, and everyone joining us from across Africa and beyond. I'm really honored to speak at this important leadership webinar that AISTR has organized. Now, we have heard from three very wonderful, brilliant, beautiful ladies, and I have really gained a lot of knowledge from all that they have been doing across Africa concerning supply chain disruptions and what we need to do to position Africa where they're supposed to be. My presentation focuses on a strategic question that should concern every university. I'm from the academia, so I always speak from my context. But what I'm presenting should also be of importance to business leaders, policymakers, and even professional bodies that are in the African continent. And the question I'm opening this presentation with is Africa building the right supply chain leadership capability? Today, we see supply chains are no longer, simply operational systems that are concerned with just moving goods from point A to point B. They have become strategic assets that are shaped by geopolitics, which is the theme of our discussion, technology, climate pressures, demographic change, trade disruptions, and even sustainability expectations. Africa now stands at a defining point. The continent has, one of the youngest populations in the world, according to AFTA, and a rapidly growing digital economy, and the transformative opportunity that AFTA presents us with. But infrastructure alone will not transform Africa. Even the infrastructure is inadequate. The real differentiator will be human capability. The leaders we prepare today for tomorrow's supply chain, then we'll ask ourselves, why does this matter now in Africa? The urgency of this conversation, I must tell you, cannot be overstated. It has to be now, because when you look globally, you see that supply chains are being reshaped by geopolitical tensions, trade wars here and there, climatic disruptions, AI adoption, everyday new things are coming up, and economic realignments. According to WEF, the World Economic Forum, approximately 39% of current workplace skills will either change significantly or become obsolete between now and 2013. That figure should resound in our minds regularly. What does it mean? It means that the competences required of future supply chain professionals will be very different from those of the past decade. And at the same time, we see that Africa faces both an opportunity and a challenge. But the opportunity is enormous, far, far, far more than the challenge. AFTA alone, Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement, creates a market of over 1.3 billion people that is roughly valued around $3.4 trillion. However, the challenge is capability. Millions of young Africans enter the labor market annually, yet employers consistently report shortages in digital skills, logistics incompetence. They don't have leadership strategies. They lack workplace, readiness, practical workplace readiness. So this presentation therefore asks, are our universities, our industries, and policy systems, are they preparing talent for the future African supply chain ecosystem? Now, we look at the future SCM competencies. we are talking about skills. Are we skilled? Do we have a population that is skilled? What are the future STEM competencies? What does it look like? The supply chain leader of tomorrow must possess very different skill profiles from those of our usual traditional logistics managers. First, we talk about digital fluency. Future leaders must understand what automation is all about. They must be conversant with AI, analytics. We're looking at blockchains, IoTs, digital platforms. These are the digital language of tomorrow's workforce and tomorrow's STM. Secondly, there is the sustainability and the ESG capability. Supply chains are now expected, to support decarbonization, circular economy models, and, responsible sourcing. Next is strategic risk management. We saw what COVID-19 did to a lot of organizations and companies. Geopolitical conflicts, where we're hearing it, the thing is sounding in every corner, in all economies right now. Trade disruptions, they have demonstrated the importance of resilience and scenario planning. And the colleagues that have spoken before me have stressed and emphasized on these. Then geopolitical awareness. Supply chain leaders now need to understand sanctions. They need to understand trade regulations, AFTA frameworks, customs systems, even cross-border compliance. And finally, on that table is ethical leadership. As supply chains become, more global and technology-driven, integrity, accountability, and stakeholder management becomes increasingly critical. And Africa's supply chain leader must therefore be able to combine all of these variables in order to be at par with contemporaries. Then I came across a publication. So before we look at Africa specifically, look at what's happening elsewhere. I came across this MIT publication, and the title stopped me. It says, "The skills gap AI left behind." Note the word, the skills gap AI left behind. AI did not close the gap. What did AI do? It moved it. AI is now doing real work in supply chains, from machine learning forecast demand across thousands of products to computer vision inspections, natural language programs classifying trade documents. LLMs give real-time decision support. So this is no longer a pilot. It is operational. It is no longer futuristic. It is no longer what is happening in the next decade. It is here and now. But what I would like us to notice is what AI demands of people. You need to evaluate the tools. You need to try to interpret the outputs. These are skills. Understand data limits. Spot where value is real and where it is hype. None of these are coding skills. You can only get used to them by studying and working with them. All of them are judgment skills, and these are skills we want to see in the future supply chain leaders in Africa. The shift for leaders is not to make every supply chain professional or for a software engineer. It is to make AI literacy a baseline business competency. And I say it again, it is to make AI literacy a baseline business competency for all our graduates, for all our young people that are entering the workforce, because that is where the world is heading to. That is the global picture. 40% of core skills changing by 2030. 77% of employers prioritizing upskilling. And now let's ask, what this means specifically for Africa. What it means is that it earns you and I, the right to make the African argument that follows. Now, we look at the gaps in the African supply chains. Africa currently faces a significant mismatch between workforce demand and available capabilities. Many employers, continually report that graduates often possess academic qualifications, but there is insufficient practical industry experiences, the limited digital SCM capabilities, weak analytics, forecasting. One peculiar example that we have in my domain is where vessel owners, indigenous vessel owners, will not employ our own seafarers on board their vessels. So why are we training the seafarers? A lot of politics, a lot of policies that are not there to ensure that our own trained seafarers have enough sea time to work on board indigenous vessels. We have weak analytics, forecasting skills among our graduates. Leadership succession challenges are there. Low exposure to global trade compliance. So we see from here that 60% of employers cite all these skill shortages, according to publications from WEF. Almost 2 out of every African employee, or of every 3 African employers, say that they cannot find the people they need. That should be worrisome on everybody's mind. African CEOs, about 87% of them, are concerned about availability of key skills. The C-suite will know this. The conversation is no longer about awareness. And we see a lot of these figures, 47 to 79%, the most hopeful number that I have on this slide. The World Bank's East Africa Skills for Transformation project that lifted graduate employment from 47 to 79% by embedding what? Industry partnership into the curriculum. So what we're saying here is that partnerships work. The gap is solvable, but partnerships work. That is some good news for me. Research consistently shows that industry-led curricula and competency-based training dramatically will improve employability outcomes. And we have 4 measures for this framework. You have to diagnose capability gaps, current versus future competencies. You need to prioritize future competencies. Invest in collaborative training systems. Measure outcomes continually. Africa does not have a youth population problem. Africa has a capability alignment challenge. And that is what is taking me to the next slide. It's a working capability framework that I adapted for African organizations, drawing on established maturity model traditions and current WEF and PricewaterhouseCoopers workforce data. The distribution here is indicative. So there is no continental survey that measures this precisely yet. But frankly, building that evidence base is itself part of the research agenda that we should be advancing through institutions like AIS, SCR, and other partner institutions that we're working with. This model, what it does, that it illustrates 5 levels of SCM leadership maturity across African organizations. At the lower levels is where we have awareness and foundational challenges. Organizations operate reactively without, having strategic capabilities. Then at the higher levels, that's where you have the strategic and transformational. We just finished a supply chain war room that was organized out by African Center for Supply Chain. It's it was wonderful. It was very elaborative. We came out with a framework that is called RAPID. I won't dwell on it now, but it's something that we can collaborate on with AISTR to take further for African organizations. So unfortunately, many African organizations, still operate at levels 1 and 2. Very few have reached, transformational maturity. The implication is very important. Africa cannot compete globally if supply chain leadership remains transactional rather than strategic. Our educational institutions, therefore, have a very critical responsibility to help organizations move upwards across this maturity ladder. Now, we know strategically that no single institution can solve Africa's supply chain capability challenge alone. And that is why universities provide foundational knowledge and research. Industries should provide practical realities, workplace exposure, and evolving market needs. Professional bodies and government will therefore provide the standards, the certification, the framework, the mobility framework and regulatory alignment that is needed to push these research and collaboration forward. The most successful systems that we've seen globally are the collaborative ecosystems. At Lagos State University, I must have to blow my trumpet here. We are the only school of transport and logistics in Africa. And we strongly believe in this industry co-creation. And embedded in this co-creation is internships with industries. We have partnerships with them, executive education, because you need to train the trainer. Many of our executives are still thinking traditionally. We have guest lectures, joint research, professional certification pathways, and curriculum review, with industry participation. The evidence is clear. And when universities and industries collaborate effectively, we'll see that our graduates' employability, will improve drastically. Then we'll think about curriculum redesign. Traditional curriculum models are no longer sufficient, for the modern supply chain environment. Curricula must evolve from content-heavy approaches towards competency-based learning systems. We must embed digital logistics. I've mentioned AI. We must have real-world case studies, industry certifications, simulation labs, experiential learning, entrepreneurship, and innovation focus. Importantly, the new curriculum must integrate all of this. Geopolitics, we must start studying after, studying about after. We must start looking at ethics. We must start, working together to integrate all of this learning. At LASU here, we are intentional about aligning supply chain education with, Africa's emerging realities. And our objective is to produce graduates who are not only employable, but also capable of this transformation we are speaking about in Africa. And I stand proud to see that most, if not all of our graduates, as they are coming out, they are being absorbed by many of our partner industries who know what we stand for and know that, and they've been giving testimonies to that. So, sorry? Preston, did you say something? Hello,
no,
Preston?
Doc, please proceed. I think it's some interference, but let's proceed.
Okay, so we have some of our leadership models that we follow that we're looking at across Africa. I've mentioned ours so that I don't blow my trumpet. So, but I must recognize some of our partners that have been doing great work with us. the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, African Resource Center of Excellence in Supply Chain Management. They learned logistics by Queen Foundation. In fact, they were instrumental to the curriculum of logistics and transport and supply chain in the undergraduate level, the BSc, that has been approved by the National Universities Commission, and it is currently going on. We are going to the third year right now in the School of Transport and Logistics. So the goal is to, be able to stand firm and demonstrate that universities can serve as strategic engines, for the economic transformation that we are looking forward to in Africa, and not just mere institutions for producing certificates. We are also producing talent. Kenya is also doing a lot of work around that area because I know, for example, the Kenyan example that shows competency-based training and industry placement that has improved the employment outcomes significantly. And even the South African model demonstrates the importance of, institutionalized investment in workforce development through levy funded systems. But despite different national contexts, the common lesson is consistent. Sustainable supply chain capability requires co-investment by government, professional bodies, industries, universities. Okay, so let's see what it means to build Africa's supply chain leadership pipeline. First of all, Africa must honestly try to assess current leadership capability levels. Curricula must be redesigned. Competencies must shift, from digital, from ESG, geopolitical, ethical. The skills gap are solvable, but you see, partnerships must come into play. We must be able to form integrations with partners, and you create curriculum design with the industries. We invite them. The way we run our projects here is that we send the students to some of the industries to go study them. What is going on? What are the challenges that you're facing? Then you come back, you now research into those problems, then pilot it. That becomes your project, group project. You pilot it, and we will see the consequences of the decisions you take in those organizations, and they will give us a feedback that on your project, if it's working or if it's not, or if we need to plug, if we need to remove, if we need to do one or two things. But this is the way we co-design curriculum with the industries that is going to give us that lifelong learning that we need to sustain our industry, our supply chain industries in Africa. Africa's supply chain, the future is already built. And we're saying that it is built or it will be broken in our classrooms. Well, to conclude, I must say that Africa needs to honestly start thinking about this collaboration with industries, with AFTA. We must start thinking about partnerships. We must be able to scale them across universities, across the government, across all the professional institutions we have. Most importantly, our workforce development must become continuous rather than sudden or episodic, when it is needed. The future African supply chain leaders will not just emerge accidentally. We must put in the work. It must be intentionally developed through coordinated investment in education. Mentorship is a very critical process that we should also invest in. Industry exposure and leadership formation. Let me conclude here with this statement. that Africa's generation, next generation, will not simply inherit supply chains. They will design them. Thank you very much for listening.